I'm delighted that both Aaron Reeves and Sam Friedman are joining us today. I'm Claire Callender. I'm Deputy Director of the Centre for Global Higher Education, and this seminar is falling within the remit of CG's activities. Because we also have online webinars a couple of times a week on a Tuesday and a Thursday, but I think they end at the end of July or whatever. Anyway, so I'm delighted. Let me give you a bit of background before I give the floor to Aaron and Sam. So Aaron Reeves is Professor of Sociology and Social Policy in the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at Oxford University and a Fellow of Green Templeton. He's also a visiting Senior Fellow in the International Inequalities Institute at the LSE. And he's a sociologist working in public health, political economy and elites. Sam is Professor of Sociology at the LSE and has published widely on class culture and social mobility. So, for example, he recently co-authored a book called The Glass Ceiling, Why It Pays to Be Privileged. I can vouch for that. And he's author of Comedy and Distinction, the Cultural Currency of a Good Sense of Humour, and co-author of Social Class in the 21st Century. The two of them are currently writing another book looking at the historical development of British elite and drawing on the entire 125-year database of who's who. Over to you guys.
Wonderful.
And both of those are for you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction and for the invitation. Aaron and I are going to talk today about some selected findings that come out of the book that Claire mentioned there, that we're currently rushing to finish at the end of this month, which we're provisionally calling Extraordinary: Why the Elites Are Not Like You and Try to Convince You Otherwise. I want to start with Henry, not his real name, of course, a recently retired corporate lawyer, who you can see here reacted angrily when we asked him in an interview whether he saw himself as a member of the British elite. Complete rubbish, he says. Now, something felt a little bit incongruous about Henry's outrage. Maybe it was the fact that we were sitting in the drawing room of his 7-bedroom townhouse in Bloomsbury. Maybe it was the fact that we knew that his wealth extended beyond £10 million, or that he owns at least 2 additional homes. Maybe it was the huge self-portrait of him that hung opposite as we talked. Or maybe it was something about Henry's background and life trajectory. His father held a very senior post in the civil service, as did his grandfather. He went to one of Britain's most prestigious elite boarding schools, where his father was also a pupil. He attended Oxford, and for more than 30 years he was a senior partner at a Magic Circle law firm. Or maybe it was just that as we spoke, and despite his protestations otherwise, it actually became abundantly clear that Henry was actually hugely influential. His personal networks included the Governor of the Bank of England, a former Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he spoke of various times in his career where he'd levered his position to lobby ministers and bring about political change. Henry then appeared to us, at least, to be the embodiment of the British elite, both in origin and in destination. But clearly, and like the vast majority of the people that we spoke to for this book, this is not how Henry saw himself. He rejected the idea that privilege had had a significant role in his success, and instead saw himself as an exemplar of a more meritocratic era in Britain. But the analysis we want to share with you today of how Britain has made its elites over the last 125 years, we want to argue that there is a kind of dangerous disconnect between how elites like Henry see themselves and seek to present themselves often in public, and what we can discern about them when we analyse carefully patterns of elite reproduction. In many ways, we're going to go on and show the British elite hasn't changed a lot. it continues to be an incredibly socially exclusive formation. And the power of Oxbridge in particular continues to be central to how we make our elites in this country. So that's the basic punchline of the talk. Let me row back a bit and tell you a bit about how we're going to get there. What questions underpin our analysis? So first, the overall project. This basically asks a fairly simple research question. How has Britain's elites changed over the last 125 years? And specifically, is it still dominated by the wealthy, the privately schooled, and especially important for today, the Oxbridge educated? But of course, the first sort of starting point when we ask these sorts of questions is what are we actually talking about when we use the term elite? Popular interest in elites has never been higher, but flanking this, as John Scott writes here, is often a maddening conceptual fuzziness. The elite attached as a term, pejorative to almost any, it seems, powerful, advantaged, qualified or privileged group. Social scientific definitions are often similarly broad. This is perhaps the most cited, comes from Seamus Khan, where he argues that elites are those with disproportionate access to and control over a range of economic, social, cultural and political resources. Now this is at once entirely reasonable as a definition, but also, I think, unhelpfully inclusive. Certainly it means many contemporary studies often operationalise very broad thresholds of eliteness. Perhaps the most notorious contemporary example of this comes from the recent work of British political scientist Matthew Goodwin, who argues that Britain is in the grip of a political revolution with influence increasingly wielded by what he calls a new elite, but that those represent 25% of the population. How can 25% of the population, we would ask, or approximately 17 million people, represent an elite? The numbers don't seem to add up. So for us, the meaning of the term must be both conceptually coherent, but also an appropriate order of magnitude preserved. In this way, the primary conception of the elite we're using in this project is Who's Who, the leading biographical dictionary of noteworthy and influential individuals in the UK, which has been published every year since its inception in 1897. We think Who's Who represents a much more precise measure of the British elite. It's consistently represented about 0.05% of the UK population. And it's also coherent conceptually in the sense that it primarily documents an elite based on position. This idea is famously associated with the Italian scholar Mosca, who argued that elites are best understood as ruling minorities, empowered through their ability to exercise authority over others and usually occupying top positions in organisational hierarchies. So in this way, about half the people in Who's Who are included automatically. So members of parliament, peers, judges, ambassadors, FTSE 100 CEOs, among many others, are all included just by virtue of their office. The other 50% are also positional elites, we would argue, but are selected based on reputation. So a board of long-standing advisors make an assessment of an individual's professional impact on British society. Finally, inclusion itself, we would argue, acts as a consecration marker in its own right. It both actively reflects and constructs a widely recognised and public-facing and publicly searchable British elite. So what does that group actually look like? Well, unsurprisingly, it's very select. There's about 35,000 people in the current version of Who's Who. And as you can see, it's disproportionately made up of white men from fairly privileged backgrounds. For example, nearly half were educated at private school, and 35% at Oxbridge. Much more on that later. Also drawing on a survey that we sent to people in Who's Who, we can see that this is also a pretty wealthy group. 16% earn more than £175,000 a year, 12% have more than 4 million in assets. So this is the main group we're working with. How are we analysing them? We're trying to do both longitudinal and mixed methods here. So we're first marshalling a range of quantitative data, so the entire historical database of Who's Who, as mentioned, Also probate records that help us get at the wealth, death of people in Who's Who, but also their parents. A bespoke survey and the entire archive of desert island discs, but I won't have time to talk much about that today. And we're trying to combine that with then longitudinal qualitative data. Okay, we have about close to 200 interviews now, actually a little more than that's on the slide. They're organised into kind of 4 birth cohorts that cover the spread of the 20th century. Around 70 of these were those that were done actually at the middle or earlier part of the 20th century as part of the National Life Story series in the British Library, which we then matched to people in Who's Who, and then a further 100, I think 20 or so now, we've carried out among ourselves and our team at Oxford. So our talk today is largely about the power of Oxbridge, but I also want to place this analysis in the kind of broader context of the book. And here, as I mentioned at the start, one of the most striking findings is really that the contemporary British elite, I think in line actually with other studies in this area, tend to eschew their influence. They tend to stress instead their ordinariness. And this comes out in a number of ways. First is via very, very simply interview responses to that question itself, where we asked people, do you consider yourself a part of the elite? And the vast majority, like Henry, strongly pushed back on this. They often expressed, as you can see in some of these quotes, even a kind of sense of anger or offence at that characterisation. But you might say, as I mentioned, that this is fairly understandable, right? The term is widely used in a pejorative way. Perhaps this is logical. But this sentiment also came out in a number of other ways, and I want to just touch on 2. I think the first way it was expressed was in interviews around kind of what we would call narratives of progression, narratives of opening up, that the elite world that these people occupied used to be closed, okay? Used to be socially exclusive, but that things have changed, things have become more meritocratic over time. Now, it's worth saying that those sort of comparative narratives are not necessarily about the recent past. Many people didn't think Britain has got more open in the last 20 years, but instead most pitched their comparisons to the kind of earlier part of the 20th century. As you can see Duncan does here, arguing the power of elite boarding schools has strongly diminished, and Henry, to go back to the start, did this very strongly in terms of this idea that the city had become hugely more meritocratic over time. The second way that people kind of claimed ordinariness was via somewhat tortured discussions in interviews about their own background, particularly among many we interviewed who were from fairly unambiguously elite origins. Like Victoria here, she was a celebrated professor, she had clear sort of aristocratic roots. And some of our interviewees clearly acknowledged this privilege, but for many like Victoria, this was a distinctly uncomfortable topic. Answers were stilted rather than direct, elaborate but vague. And I think what you can see if you look at this quote here is not only the kind of palpable awkwardness, but also Victoria's desire to kind of play down her elite origins, to not appear posh. And it's actually telling that in our survey of people in Who's Who, 30% of the sample reported their class origins as less advantaged than the standard way that they would be measured based on their parental occupation. So that, by that I mean people who describe their background as working class when their parents have professional or managerial jobs, or describe their background as lower middle class when their parents did higher managerial or professional jobs. And like Victoria, many attempted to kind of deflect from or downplay aspects of their upbringing that might signal eliteness, sometimes via comparison with more advantaged peers, or sometimes by kind of presenting their origin story via a kind of extended family history of upward social mobility, of meritocratic striving. So overall, there was a sense that instinctively these people wanted to tell an upward story. They wanted to claim a meritocratic legitimacy for their eliteness. Something, interestingly, we really don't see in those much earlier British Library interviews with people at the start of the 20th century. In those interviews, we see a much more comfortable, self-conscious upper-class identity. among interviewees. But why do we care about these expressions of ordinariness sociologically? Elites want to be seen as humble, normal, ordinary, particularly in public. Okay, but who cares, and what's that got to do with Oxbridge? Well, I think the key reason these qualitative findings struck us as interesting is because they seem to directly contradict what we were seeing quantitatively about the enduring power of Britain's key channels of elite recruitment. So first, for example, we look at this sort of claim that Britain's elite has opened up over time in terms of its origins, in terms of the kind of historical caricature of ascribed elite privilege. To get at this, the power of elite origins, as I mentioned, we track down the wealth at death of people, of parents of people in Who's Who, and use this to look at the proportion of people in Who's Who whose parents were in the top 1%, 5% of the national probate wealth distribution when they died. So what do we find? This figure basically tells you two things. First, that a disproportionate number of people in Who's Who are from fairly privileged backgrounds. Okay? So, about 20% over time hail from the top 1% of the wealth distribution. But secondly, I think perhaps more interestingly for us, this figure also shows, contrary to those kind of contemporary elite perceptions, the relationship between wealth and elite recruitment has stayed pretty stable throughout the 20th century. And I think the reason why this is quite sort of remarkable in a way is that it's persisted despite the fact that huge changes have taken place in the relative wealth of the top 1% over the 20th century. So we know, for example, and this shows very clearly, that the share of Britain's overall wealth taken by the 1% went down precipitously from about 75% to about 30% over this period. And yet somehow, despite being comparatively less rich, the ability of wealthy families to propel their offspring into the most influential positions hasn't been dented at all. So elite origins matter. What about our most elite private schools? So these are our 9 Clarendon schools. I'm sure you will have heard of most of these schools. Has the proportion of people reaching Who's Who from these private, largely male-only, very expensive institutions changed over time? Well, actually, more so, I think. There is a notable decline story if you follow this black line, which is showing you how many people in Who's Who came from a Clarendon school. About 20% at the start of our period drops to less than 10% in the latest both cohorts. Now this is a decline that I think is definitely noteworthy, but I think you have to kind of also see that this is a persistent story, that these schools remain, in comparative terms, extraordinarily powerful channels of elite formation. And this is, I think, supported by this figure that examines the educational background of individuals added to Who's Who in the last kind of 25 years. And this shows you that the proportion of new entrants from these elite schools has actually remained fairly constant over this last sort of 25 years. So any kind of decline in the reproductive power of elite schools, I think, has largely stalled. So what of Oxbridge? I will pass over to Aaron to get to the key part of the presentation.
Thanks, Sam. So we already have this sense, I think, that Oxbridge is incredibly powerful, influential in terms of the formation of the British elite, and I don't think we're going to tell you anything that's radically going to change that. But the story is a little bit more complex than just this straightforward linear story. However, when we look at it just purely in terms of the proportion of people that are in Who's Who that have attended different kinds of universities, we do see a really quite surprising degree of persistence. So pretty much since the start of Who's Who, somewhere between 30 to 40% of people who end up in this book have at least at one point in their lives studied at either Oxford or Cambridge. Now this should be seen, I think, against a wider trend which is the black line at the top, which is just the kind of increasing likelihood that people have gone to university at all over this period among people that get into who's who. And a lot of that growth has happened in Russell Group universities, including places like this, LSE, others around the corner, but also non-London-based Russell Group universities too. Now that's understandable in some ways because these universities have expanded dramatically over this period. Indeed, really for me, I think the persistence of Oxbridge should be viewed against this graph, which is the proportion, roughly speaking, it's a little bit messy at the beginning of the graph, of Oxbridge students as a proportion of all university students in the country at the time. So basically, Oxford now educates a tiny number of the undergraduate population in the UK, and yet we see a really quite remarkable degree of persistence despite that decline. And so, in some ways, we think this is kind of a puzzle and wanted to try and understand this in a little bit more detail. So to do that, we wanted to think about how do we go about comparing the likelihood of getting into Who's Who, this sort of book of the elite, given that you attended Oxford or Cambridge and a variety of other universities. So to do that, there's a variety of ways you can make this comparison, and that's why I put apples and oranges here, because there's not a perfect way to do this. But what we've done is compared, if you went to Oxford or any other university, compared to those who didn't attend university at all. So it's kind of a stable, if you like, comparison group, but one that is changing over time, and we can talk about how that might affect our results. And this is broadly what we see. So at the end of the sort of 19th century, if you attended Oxford or Cambridge, you had this just extraordinary ability to get into the elite. I mean, you were like over 400 times more likely to reach Who's Who than other people that never attended a university over that period. And in some ways, this is actually borne out in the data. To give you the scale of this, so like we can only estimate this because the numbers aren't perfect, but basically about a quarter of people that were attending Oxford and Cambridge in this early period were ending up in Who's Who, which is really quite remarkable if you think about that Who's Who represents such a tiny proportion of the population. But what is happening here in this graph too is a very real decline in terms of Oxford and Cambridge's power in propelling their alumni into the elite. It comes down through the birth cohorts in the 1930s and 40s, and then, I think somewhat surprisingly, we start to see a bit of a resurgence. That power starts to rise again. And this, I think, is even more puzzling given what we've already said. Before sort of diving into the kind of Oxford story in more detail, I want to look at this question of, is there a kind of golden triangle, right? Like we allude to this in the graph there, and I want to unpack this in a little bit more detail. Because we can see that these sort of Russell Group London-based universities are still sort of doing relatively well, but they're not really in the same kind of realm or stratosphere as Oxford and Cambridge. And so there's a question, I think, to ask here is like, are these really kind of participating in the same cycle or circles of elite reproduction? And I think we would want to argue that they are. And the reason is that actually what Oxford and Cambridge are doing here is just their degree of power is so large that it's making these differences look relatively small. But actually when you kind of blow them apart, what you can see is that if you went to a Russell Group university in London, you're almost 100 times more likely to get into Who's Who than someone that didn't go to university, which is really quite remarkable. And that's twice the size as going to kind of any other university in the country. What's really, I think, surprising is that when you look at the other Russell Group universities outside of London, they're not really kind of doing a great deal of extra work in terms of like propelling their alumni than other universities. And so I think that does give us some reason to think that, you know, these London-based universities are doing something a little bit different than other kind of prestigious research-intensive universities. So this then, I think, brings us back to this question of like, what explains this up and down rise in terms of Oxford and Cambridge's specific power of reaching the elite? And to do that, we want to think about this sort of the mythic place that Oxford and Cambridge have in the national psyche. So this picture is from the 1980s. A photographer called Daffyd Jones, who was attending, I think it was Cambridge at the time, and kind of captured these kind of amazing images. This is the era of the bright young things, of Hugh Laurie and Stephen Young and Boris Johnson. But it's also that period where you start to see that resurgence of power of these universities. So what is it about this period compared to those earlier periods that's making this difference? So to understand this, we go to those interviews that we talked about earlier and that Sam's already alluded to. So this is Sir David Steele. His father was the secretary to Winston Churchill, as well as working in business. His grandfather was the schoolmaster of Rugby School, where David himself attended. His family, or when his father died, his father's kind of wealth at that time was in the top 1% of the distribution. So a relatively privileged, affluent, powerful person who then eventually became a senior figure in finance. And he talks about how he got into Oxford. So he talks about his brother already kind of having gone up to University College. His grandfather and father also went to University College in Oxford. And he applied, he took the scholarship exam, but he didn't pass. But he still got an exhibition, which is a kind of small scholarship that was offered. And in telling this part of the story, again, like Sam's alluded to, his sort of narrative becomes a little bit more complicated, right? He starts to say, well, you know, it helped, the money helped my parents a bit, but it was an academic thing. I mean, it wasn't anything, because maybe it was an exhibition to UNIV. So, except there are quite a number of people, Rugby had a connection with University College at Oxford, so then I went up. So the interviewer kind of, I think, sees what's going on here a little bit and says, so it could have been sort of closed to Rugby students. And he's like, yeah, it was a closed grant to Rugby students. So David's ability to kind of get into Oxford wasn't necessarily linked to his academic prowess, but really intimately tied to the particular school that he went to, which was also a product of the fact that his grandfather was the master there and his dad was very wealthy. Now, at Oxford, what was his experience? So these are a couple of moments in the interview that I've pulled out to sort of illuminate a couple of key points. So he acknowledges that he wasn't necessarily a great scholar. And this isn't necessarily, we think, false modesty. He wasn't a particularly stellar performer. Even he talks about his grades and not doing particularly well in a number of them. But he also talks about the college that he went to being a really quite heavily drinking college. And he spent a lot of time playing cricket, enjoying himself, being part of some of the elite clubs that were there. And he has this lovely moment where he has aunts who live in Oxford and he goes to visit them on a Sunday. And this is indeed William Beveridge, who's at the dinner. And he got to know William Beveridge really well because he became head of University College while he was there. So they're all sitting around chatting and the aunt says to him, oh, I hear you're doing really well. And Mr. Beveridge turns to him and says, yes, you're so good at putting down drink, right? And he loves that. He thinks it's a really nice phrase and he sort of laughs about it. But the greatest thing, he said, the most important thing is he had the greatest fun while he was there. Now, so David represents a particular moment in Oxford's history when it was this kind of really high levels of elite reproduction. David gets to go and work in his father's firm. And then we have that period where it starts to decline. And Hugh Peppier is an example of that moment. So, like David, he talks about the amount of fun that it was being at Oxford. He also says that he didn't work very hard while he was there. And during this period, we have the idea of a kind of gentleman's third, right? Like the people that would go to university, not work very hard, not get particularly good grades, and sort of move on. Now, Hugh was sort of part of that process, and part of the reason it didn't matter that much is captured beautifully by another one of our interviewees called Anthony Mallison. And he says basically the class of your degree didn't matter at all to your ability to get jobs post-university. He's like, I don't even think I knew of the class of degree of anyone that I worked with, and they certainly didn't know mine. And so the idea that you could just not perform very well, and as long as you got through, it would be fine on the back end. So there was a sense that you didn't really need to work hard to ensure success, and that was true still in this middle period of that cohort that were in the 1930s and 40s. Now, Hugh is interesting precisely because he notes this change. So he goes up to Oxford in the kind of early 50s. And he has these two experiences that we'll draw out now in the early 60s that point to these sorts of changes that we're starting to see. So he goes back to visit the college, and he talks to one of the porters there, Basil. He says, how is everything, Basil? Now, Basil says to me, hey, he says, it's all changed, it's all changed. What do you mean? No bottles about. Sir, there are hundreds of bottles, but they're all milk bottles. And the point that Hugh is trying to get at here via this story is that you've gone from this period of heavy drinking and fun to sort of hard-working, healthy, diligent kinds of students. There's a different kind of feel and atmosphere in the college. And this really matters because of something else that he noticed. So when Hugh left university, he also got a job in his father's firm. But he shares these two vignettes that we think are particularly illuminating. So Martin Hunter, a guy that got to be a senior partner with him in the firm, they kind of came up together. He was interviewed, Martin was interviewed by Hugh's father. And he says, well, you know, of course he came here because he was, his father was the housemaster at Winchester. And he was interviewed by my father, and after half an hour of talking about sailing and his father and my housemaster and cricket, another important subject, my father put his hand out and said, well, when do you want to start? And that was it. And he says Hugh was like, that was a typical interview in those days. Now, Hugh would know this because he was head of recruitment during this period. Now, what happens is after a couple of years, Freshfields, the company that Hugh worked for, had fallen behind in size. It hadn't kept up with some of its competitors. And the reason was that it had relied, he argues, on traditional methods of recruitment. The idea that people that they would know would come along and say, you know, could you take my boy? That stopped. And they recognised in the early 60s that it became an extremely inadequate way to recruit. So what seems to be happening, and is alluded to in this moment, is a changing priorities, both within some of the firms that these children would have traditionally got into, but also within the universities themselves. So there is, and this has been documented by Suarez, a sense that Oxford and Cambridge adopted a sort of new agenda of social equality. Now, I think we have to kind of put that in inverted commas a little bit, but I want to talk about some of the ways in which that actually materially played out. So the first was that they got rid of Latin requirements for some subjects, right? Like this happened in the early 60s. A couple of years later, they got rid of the separate admissions process for the sons of gentlemen. That was gone. Then, a couple of years later, they got rid of the separate processes for independent school applicants and state school applicants. So what you see is this sort of sense that actually some of those old mechanisms through which you were able to get into these universities started to decline. And as we go through, the stories that we start to hear about the people that we spoke to, their experience of Oxford also starts to change. And what comes through is a really keen sense that people start to have to work very hard. And they also talk a lot more about the things that they got intellectually from their experience at Oxford. That almost never happened in the early period. Indeed, if we go kind of a bit more kind of concrete, among those born before 1940, over 1/3 of our interviewees explicitly say that they either did not work very hard or that they didn't do well at all. Only one of our interviewees post-1940 said the same kind of thing. So before 1940, 6 of our interviewees said they didn't even pass the entrance exam to Oxbridge and still got in. Post-1940, only one person says to us that they failed the entrance exam and they went somewhere else. Right? So there's just this really quite striking break that seems to happen in terms of the narratives that we get. So for us, what's important about this moment is that somewhere in this sort of 1930s, 1940s cohort that are coming of age in the 60s and 70s with the decline of deference and the routinization of recruitment is, we argue, the kind of end of certainty. It's not that these children, I want to be clear about this, it's not that these children didn't still have a great degree of advantage, but they couldn't simply rely on their dad getting them a job in the same way that happened in the 1910s and 1920s. And so this comes through again and again and again. And though these children, while privileged, still had to work harder than the earlier generations. And it's that hard work that starts to kick in, we think, and the kind of competition around Oxford that starts to push up that number again towards the end of the period. But there is another question that I think also we need to sort of address and that comes through in the accounts that we get. And this comes from, I think this is sort of gestured to by the work of C. Wright Mills, who wrote about the power elite in the mid-50s in the US. And in that context, he talked about the two Harvards. A Harvard for a closely knit network of old boys and a Harvard for everyone else. We also start to see that same kind of picture within these universities too. And we want to provide just a little bit of data to back that up. So firstly, in this graph, what we can show is this is again kind of going back to people in Who's Who, and it's the proportion of people who went to Oxbridge, given that they already attended a particular kind of school. So we see that basically, among the Clarendon School alumni that we have in Who's Who, about 60% of them, declines a little bit down to 50%, attended Oxbridge as well. So there's this kind of quite close link between these two institutions. Much weaker for other kinds of schools. And so what we're interested in is this question of what happens within Oxford and Cambridge when you get there, given that you went to one of these schools before. And what we've done here is calculated the odds ratios of reaching Who's Who, given that you were in one of these kind of 2-by-2 situations. So the baseline here is people that didn't attend either Clarendon School or Oxbridge. And then we compare those to people that attended Oxbridge but didn't go to a Clarendon School, that attended a Clarendon School but never went to Oxbridge, and then this group at the bottom are those that attended both, Clarendon School and Oxbridge. Now there's a general decline here, which is interesting, but the thing that I really want you to focus on is these two sets of numbers, which is that these compare people that both got into Oxford and Cambridge and their likelihood of getting into the elite. But what it does is it compares that experience given that you were in Clarendon School. What you can basically see is that having attended a Clarendon School before you went to Oxbridge almost doubles your chances of reaching Who's Who, relatively speaking. Now that, again, I think alludes to the sense that this sort of two Oxbridges is really operating and existing in a meaningful way. We also do this with wealth. Now this is a little bit more tricky because we don't have good data on the kind of wealth distribution of students in Oxbridge, right? So what we've got here is some sort of hypothetical scenarios to kind of think about what those odds ratios could look like. And again, what I want you to do is focus on the two red lines. So what really matters here, I think, is that we see almost exactly the same kind of story. The only way that wouldn't be true is if 20% of the students at Oxbridge came from the top 1% of the wealth distribution, which, given what we know about the income distribution of Oxbridge students, we do know something about that, is very, very unlikely. So that seems to again suggest to us that coming from wealth and then going to Oxford or Cambridge still kind of has this added advantage. So in the last few minutes, I want to touch on some of the ways in which this comes through clearly in our interviews. This is Sir Peter Daniell, again, very wealthy family, who got a job in a finance firm post-Oxford. He actually did get a third while he was there and was one of these people that kind of didn't work hard, had a lot of fun, and then was able to move on and eventually became senior broker to the government. So like an incredibly powerful position. And he talks about going to Trinity College. He was at Eton before. And he says, so he's got talking about Trinity being quite like a diverse place, and he talks about the intake being 10 Etonians, 8 Rugbyans, 8 Wickhamists, 5 from Marlborough, 4 from Tonbridge. Now these are all really privileged private schools. And he says that he had a friend of his that went to Christchurch in Oxford, which is the kind of traditional place that you would have gone to in Oxford if you had attended Eton. Peter at that time hadn't done particularly well at school, and so they tried to find another route in through a cousin who put in a good word for him at Trinity and got him in there. But he says, you know, a great friend of mine went to Christchurch and he never knew anybody but old Etonians, right, the whole way through. So the interviewer then a bit later on says, well, you know, you must have met some boys from state schools and that must have been quite a new social experience for you. And he's like, yeah, like up to a point. And up to a point means it's not that he'd ever met them before, it's that he didn't really hang out with them too much while he was there. And he says, of course, that they had a slightly different accent and that sort of thing affected one a bit. But they generally fit in because they were selected they were rather carefully chosen. So what you get from this is not explicit that Peter's saying, oh, like there was this real, you know, 2 Oxbridges going on, but you can get this very visceral sense that the kinds of people that you spent time with were really structured by your social origins. And this was actually explicit. So Philip Landon, one of the dons in Oxbridge, took it upon himself to cultivate this Etonian clique, right? So he wasn't Peter's tutor, but he just recognised, so he sort of knew that Peter was an old Etonian, and so kind of gathered them together, and they used to go to his room and hang out, and he said he was enormously influential on him. He didn't like any of his teachers because they didn't like the work that he was doing. As we said, he didn't do particularly well. Moving forward to the 80s, the world had sort of changed slightly. So this is Toby Young, who attended kind of similar era to Boris Johnson and actually was part of an edited collection that was edited by Boris Johnson's daughter, Rachel Johnson. It was called The Oxford Myth. And in his essay, he writes about class at Oxford. And he draws this distinction between stains and socialites. Stains were the kind of hard-working, middle-class kids who came from places like Slough, and I think that's the place he refers to. And he compared them with the socialites, who basically were the alumni of Eton and Winchester. He says the smart set, the socialites, were either rich, upper class, or both. Right? And what Toby Young reflects on is how he sort of recognised initially that he was a bit of a stain, but didn't really want to be a stain, so he tried to kind of get in with the crowd of the socialites. But what I think is important about Young's account here is that even in the 80s, this sort of process is still playing out. It's certainly not as kind of socially uniform or socially homogeneous as it once was. You have a much more kind of diverse intake, as we sort of alluded to, but these processes are still playing out. So this is Gautam, who went in exactly this period. He comes from a state school, and he says, I found the first few months a real culture shock, because it was very public schooling. Now, what was crucial for Gautam is that after a little while, he made a friend, and that friend was part of the St. Paul's group, one of the Clarendon schools. That radically changed his experience because he got brought into the inside of that sort of social circle. He got brought onto the inside of the two Oxbridges, if you like. And it was this link that had a really profound influence on his experience. Again, what I think is really important here is that it gives us the sense of what it would have felt like had he not been able to be brought into that group, right? The sense that these networks wouldn't have operated in quite the same way for him. So zooming back out, the kind of big argument that we're going to try and make both in the book and as part of this chapter is that the British elite, they perform a kind of ordinariness by drawing distinctions with an aristocratic past. But at the same time, the evidence that we've been able to point to here is that there has been a really high degree of continuity within the elite. It's not that there's been no change at all, but what we see is that in terms of wealth origins, in terms of the power of a certain number of public schools, and even the power of Oxford and Cambridge, a high degree of continuity in their influence. Now that doesn't mean that there hasn't been some sort of complication, some unevenness in that process over time. And we sort of alluded here to ways in which the processes of recruitment into Oxbridge may be conflicted with changing social realities in the post-Second World War. But both the schools, that includes the kind of Clarendon schools, and the students themselves, and we think the parents, sort of responded to those pressures in new ways that enabled places like Oxford and Cambridge to reassert their dominance. And crucially for us, we still see evidence, we think, of this sort of two Oxbridges phenomena. That even within these institutions, there are different kinds of experiences, different networks that are operating that might enable you to, or increase your likelihood of reaching the British elite. But what's important about this is that the institutional unity of these like universities masks this duality. Like getting into Oxford is just getting into Oxford, but really, at least according to us, it's not. There are different things that are happening within those social worlds. So what do we think then in terms of like actual practical implications of this? We have two, and I'm going to say these very briefly because I think we've already gone over time, so I'm sorry for that. The first is that we think that Oxford and Cambridge need to start measuring class origins at the household level rather than what they currently do, which is looking at geographies or schools that people previously attended to. Now there is some sort of contextual pressure in terms of admissions processes, but actually we know very little about how people from particular class backgrounds in terms of income or occupation actually succeed or not within that system. And we know very little about how they do going from the kind of application stage up to the admission stage. And that matters because, as you know, there's still a lot of interviewing that goes on, and there could be a variety of ways in which class influences that process. Now, we think this is a relatively kind of modest proposal, and we'd like to sort of maybe suggest something a little bit more bold. But we have to say that this comes with the caveat that we think it's probably a little bit unreasonable at the moment to expect that these universities are going to go and forego their position within the status hierarchy of universities. We think that's dysfunctional, and we'd be open to talking about this. But with that caveat, we think this might be another way to think about this problem. We think that it's possible to just eradicate applications at all for these universities. We already collect all of the information on how well people do at school, and actually you could just randomly recruit students above some attainment threshold. And indeed, you could even adjust that regionally, because we know some parts of the country historically do a little bit worse. Now, we want to be clear, we don't think that this is going to dramatically reorient the kind of social composition of Oxford. It's not going to mean that a whole bunch of working class students are suddenly going to kind of flow into that, because we know that class background affects your attainment. But we do also know that this would kind of do some work in terms of rebalancing, both geographically and potentially in terms of class background. We'd love to discuss these a little bit more if you have the inclination, but we'll stop there and look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.